Hello everyone, I'm mbl의 working for Hi-Fi Club. Today we'll have an interview with mbl's international sales manager, Mr. Antoine Hurbur씨. Is the right name?
That's correct. Thank you.
Welcome to Mr. Hurbur씨. How's your flight?
Yeah, it was a very interesting trip to get here because I stopped in Finland on the way to visit a new dealer. But I'm very happy to be here in Seoul. Fantastic city for me and very friendly people. Incredible food as well. I'm very impressed how every time I come to Korea, it just seems to be getting more and more modern and very efficient. And this, I can tell that it's not so far behind other very successful countries, such as Japan. I lived in Japan when I was younger, and I see quite some similarities. But the food here is really something special. I'm very happy to be here.
Right. First, MBL fans in Korea and our YouTube subscribers may want to know more about you. Could you tell us about yourself?
Okay, so I've been working in the hi-fi business probably almost 30 years now. I grew up in Canada, but my mother is French and my father is British. And so with those two languages, I felt that Europe was a more comfortable and better for my career to live in. And I've liked music since a very young age. My family in England, there's a lot of musicians in Britain. My grandmother was a concert pianist, and when she was 18, she was invited down to the BBC to record. And when she was there, she met Sergei Rachmaninoff, who's a very, very famous composer, and played with him and got to know him. My grandmother, Dorothy Durnley, her brother's son, his name is Christopher Durnley, and he was one of the greatest organists in Britain in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And he played the organ for Prince Charles and Lady Diana's wedding, for example, in St. Paul's Cathedral, because he was the principal organist for St. Paul's for 25 years. So music's very much in our family. I bought my first stereo when I was 13. I was delivering newspapers. We do that in Canada, which allowed me to save up the money. And I've always been a big fan of rock music from the 60s and 70s, especially starting with the Beatles. I had my first Beatles record when I was 9, given to me by my father. And my family comes from the Liverpool area, so my father actually used to go to the Cavern in the late 50s, early 60s. Unfortunately, he never saw the Beatles there. He missed them. But yeah, so I've had a career of 30 years in hi-fi, and the last 6 with MBL. And for me, it's probably the absolute crown of my career because the product is so special and so unique. And in a way, MBL has kind of remained a little bit of a hidden secret because a lot of our business, the company being founded in 1979, was actually here in Asia. We had a very strong distribution, and almost 75-80% of production was being bought by Asians. And I will go into that a little bit later as to why, and it has to do with this unique speaker technique. So in the last 6 years since I started with the company, we had a difference in strategy. We are working now not so much with distributors in Europe at all anymore. We're going direct. The fact that I can speak French and English and German helps me to speak directly with the dealers in most countries of Europe. So then we are in a relationship directly with the retail shop. And the stores in Europe really appreciate that, to be directly in contact with the chief engineer or with the sales director, to be more in line with our expectations and the production of the product. They come to the factory and visit, and so it's really helped us, and they've been supportive, and we've seen our business grow a lot in Europe. So now we're actually selling more in Europe than in Asia, though the business in Asia is still very, very strong. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard production schedules for, let's say, 101 Extreme are pushed back a lot.
Yeah, so that's a situation that's affecting probably the whole industrial world right now, and that is there's a lot of delays in getting supplies because of the COVID disruption, and of course now we have issues with this very, very unfortunate war in the Ukraine started by the president of Russia, which is something that a lot of Europeans are very disappointed about because it was very much unneeded, but that's our point of view, and that has disturbed obviously the cost of energy. So everything is costing more to produce as well. So it's a combination of being supplied the parts that we need to produce our products, and also the running costs of a business. Yeah. So we do have some delays, but we are improving. It takes us almost 1 year to train somebody who will be making a speaker. It's not just a few months, so that's why when we do hire somebody, it's to improve production in 2024, almost, you know. So right now it's true, we have between 4 to 6 months on many of our products, and the Extreme just became a very successful product for us. And we got a lot of orders in 2021 and 2022, and that's why it's almost 2 years now before we can deliver an Extreme. Yeah, yeah. But we hope that it'll speed up. We hope that in the next year it will only be maybe 8 months to 12 months for an Extreme, we hope.
MBL is one of the most well-known audio brands in the world, but some people are maybe curious about the name I mean. What MBL stands for. It's going to be really interesting if you could tell us about the brand.
Yeah, well, this is a very important part, I think, of understanding MBL, because the 3 letters represent the initials of the 3 founders. They were 3 friends that were all technicians and engineers who loved Gustav Mahler. So they do great, and they would go to the Philharmonie in Berlin and go to as many concerts as they could. But the trouble was, when they would come home, the 3 of them together, only one of them would have the same staging and imaging of the musicians as in the concert hall, because he was sitting in the middle of that triangle that you need to have to listen to music properly. As soon as you were sitting a little bit to the left or to the right, you would have the staging would drop, and you'd only hear really more the right speaker, or if you're sitting on the left, of course, the left speaker. And so they were trying to figure out, how can we do something about this? And one day, one of them got the idea, if we took the voice coil of a speaker, right? All speakers, all drivers have a voice coil. What if we turn it vertically, and because we can't send the sound up, we don't want that to happen, we want the sound maybe to go all around the room, we will then fix aluminum blades and seal it at the top so that the sound is then radiating around the room. And so they did this, and the reason that they probably came up with this idea is, actually Berlin was a very special city in the 70s, because they started the company was founded in 1979, so 43 years ago. But if you didn't want to do the army in Germany, if you want to be exempt from having to do your military service, you simply moved to West Berlin. And that was a way of keeping West Berlin, which was surrounded by communist regime of East Germany and basically influence of Russia, you would be exempt, and it would keep it populated. So it attracted a lot of artists and, shall we say, people that think differently. So it's probably no surprise that they came up with this idea, being surrounded in the cafes with a lot of other artists. And so that's how the idea came up. And then in 1982, they hired a young man who just graduated from engineering, electroacoustic engineering. And he joined the company. He was very happy to do so. His name is Jürgen Reiss. He's very, very well known in our industry, and he's with our company still to this day. And he started working on improving the quality of the sound of this omnidirectional driver that had been designed by Mr. Meletsky, Mr. Bienicke, and Mr. Lehr, the three initials. And within about 2 years, he was able to source a type of carbon fiber that was perfectly suited to be used as a driver. It took him a lot of work, but luckily Mr. Reiss was a musician also when he was in his youth, and he had a good friend who, in the band, who was specializing in making guitar necks out of carbon fiber, and that's where the introduction to carbon fiber came, was through a friend of his. And over the years, Mr. Reiss has steadily improved the driver, the carbon fiber, the mixture with the resins and so on. And now we have the eighth generation of mid-range tweeter that is here on this speaker behind me that I'll explain a little bit later. So that's the origin of MBL, is 1979, Berlin, three friends. And they know, and thanks to this pulsating sphere, so the music being radiated throughout the room, we have a much wider sweet spot. So you no longer need to sit between the two speakers. You can be sitting a little bit to the left, to the right, and still have almost exactly the same stage and imaging as though you were sitting between the speakers.
Yes, it's like more sound dispersion all over the place.
Exactly, that's exactly right, yes.
Next is, what do you think of merit for having an MBL as a non-audiophile users?
Well, actually, I'd say for non-audiophile, the big advantage is the fact that you are no longer restricted by this fixed place of seating to listen to music. You can move around the room. A lot of people that are discovering MBL for the first time, that is the first thing that they are impressed by, is the fact that you don't have to sit between the speakers. You can walk around the room and still really enjoy the music. So I'd say for a non-audiophile, that would be one of the first things. The second thing is that our electronics are advancing with technology. And for example, you can now come home with your phone and open up an application and play from millions of songs straight onto our CD DAC, because it has a built-in module called a Roon module, which allows you to stream music and play it very easily. So you can use your phone to adjust the sound, change the track, and that makes it very handy as well for a non-audiophile.
Mm-hmm. Next, we want to talk about what makes the difference between MBL and other high-end audio brands. Let's start with the speakers. The most iconic essence of MBL, I think, guess its shape. When we're looking one-on-one or one-on-one extreme models, most of people are impressed and sometimes overwhelmed by its figure. Shiny, balloon-like driver as an intense first impression of how it looks, and the radial strala, which is making the whole concept of MBL speakers. And lamella is scientific and technological cornerstone that makes all the things possible, right? Could you tell us about it more?
Okay, so that is a very important, the look of our speakers. They don't leave people indifferent. They usually have quite an opinion as to how they look. There's a lot of people that think our speakers look very beautiful, and there are some people that think they look maybe not so beautiful, but that's normal. At least you're definitely pushed to have an opinion, because they're not an ordinary looking rectangular box like a lot of speakers can be. And especially the 101E, we have found out actually that very often it's the spouse or the wife or girlfriend that finds it very, very beautiful. Actually, I have to say that in Paris, my daughter goes to the German school, and I got to know the coach for Paris Saint-Germain, and his name is Thomas Tuchel, and he came to a jazz party. I try to organize jazz parties, 3-4 per year, to promote musicians. It's very important to give back to the community of musicians, of course. And he came to the concert with his wife, and he knew about hi-fi, and he knew about vinyl especially, because his father was really into it as he grew up. And he listened to a bit of music, and he was very, very impressed. So he said, I would like to try this in my home. And eventually he grew. He started with a small system, which is the right way to do it. You know, he started with a cadenza line with a small pair of 126s. He got used to that, and he said, yeah, I think I want a little bit more body. So he went up to the 120, for example, which is a larger enclosure, slightly larger drivers. And about a year later, finally, I had a pair of 101Es that were going to be stored because of the pandemic. The Paris high-end show was postponed. So I proposed that he borrow them for a month, and instead of keeping them in a warehouse. And I set them up in his house. And when his wife came through the door and saw them and then heard how they sounded, it was actually her who made the decision, not him. She just thinks they're beautiful. So I think it's a very appealing looking speaker, personally, and it seems to suit women's tastes, especially the 101E with the big melon, which for some people, they probably don't even know what it is if they weren't told that it was a speaker. So I think that's a nice secret to have. Yeah.
Now we all know the MBL speakers are omnidirectionals, but any tips for the speaker placement or the right tone angles? Any recommendations?
Well, that's a really good question. Speaker positioning, that's something that is really important for all speakers. First of all, you should be attentive a little bit to the acoustics of your room. Here, I think we have very, very good acoustics. We have just enough little reflection that will give a liveliness to your music. You don't want the room to be too dampened by too many carpets, too many curtains. You want to have a little bit of reflection. We call that the RT60.
RT60, yes.
Yes, so that's how long does it take for a signal to be 60 dB quieter. And we estimate that about half a second, 0.45 seconds, is quite ideal, and that's usually what most living rooms are like. So once you have that, that's already a good start. And then the next thing we suggest is try to take a look at what these golden ratios are that you can find out on the websites, on the internet, I should say. And there is a certain distance you should keep relative to the side walls and to the back wall. So right here, I'm sure this is just for presentation. They can't leave the speaker in the middle of the room. But with this speaker, we would definitely be moving it at least a good 1 meter 20 to 1 meter 60 from the wall to get an ideal sound reproduction. Towing in after that is a question of taste as well, of course, and a certain tone for the room. But the nice thing about an MBL speaker is it's actually much less sensitive to the acoustics of the room thanks to the omnidirectional design of the driver. So the first signal, which is in the first 10 milliseconds, sound traveling at 343 meters per second, 10 milliseconds, so basically 1/100th of a second would make that 3.4 meters. So that first signal that you're getting, that will basically identify what the instrument is and where it's positioned. But you need the reflections in the room to then see how big the instrument is and even more precisely where it is relative to the other instruments and say voice. That's 10 to 50 milliseconds. So basically those first and even second reflections. On a conventional speaker, that in our opinion, it's a little bit more challenging because the first reflection is a very important one to adjust. And that's why even probably during this interview, if I put my hand here, it takes away all the reflections from that side and changes the tonal characteristics of my voice and so on. That's what an advantage of an MBL speaker is. It will allow the acoustics that are in the recording to blend or merge with the acoustics of the room much more successfully. So.
Now move on to electronics. For the power amp, MBL chooses the Class D amplifying system. Why MBL has been built with Class D instead of Class A or AB? And could you tell us about what is LASA is?
So that's the linear analog switching amplification. So Jürgen Reis has not only responsible for designing all the speakers since 1984, but he's also responsible for making our first preamplifier, the 6010D, and all the eventual developments in electronics have been done by Jürgen Reis. So amplification as well as preamplification as well as digital to analog converters. So he's a very, very talented man. He has taken the best of Class A, of Class AB, and Class D, and put it all in our two lines of electronics, the Cadenza and the Noble line. And so the linear analog switching amplification is something that's designed purely by Mr. Reis, and the big advantage for that is it allows us to continue to use a analog kind of traditional power supply and combine it with switching amplification, which takes a lot less heat dissipation to deal with. So we don't need to have such big heat sinks. As you can see, the Noble line is quite compact in size, but at the same time it still puts out a lot of power, which we do need for our speakers because of their efficiency is a little bit on the lower side at 81 dB. But for example, the N51, which I believe we have here, is able to deliver 380 watts, though it's very small in size. But if you try to lift it, you realize, oh my goodness, it's a serious amplifier because it weighs about 27 kilos because of the toroidal transformer.
Now let's talk about the Unitygain functions on preamps. I think it's something to do with a line level signal from a source and impedances between devices. Could you get more specific for the Korean fans?
Right. Well, that's again something that Jürgen Reis noticed, and that is we've got a 2-volt signal coming out of most phono stages of today and the CD DAC, the analog section of a converter or a CD player. And so he felt we don't need to give gain in the preamplification stage, only a little bit, like 1.4 dB is what we feel is just the right level so that the signal coming from the source, so whether it be the phono output or the analog output of a DAC, is then transmitted to the amplifier without unnecessary gain from the preamplifier. And that allows you to have much greater dynamics, less distortion, and just a quieter background. That's the function of the Unitygain. So actually we're one of the few, I believe, that do something like that. And that basically, when you put on Unitygain, you're turning off the gain. So in a way, you're kind of, you're not actually adding, it's the other way around, you're kind of taking away. So, but if you feel you want to play a little bit louder or you know, you want to go more in like a party mode with your system, then you would turn it off because the volume is limited to 70 when you have Unitygain applied, which we feel is about the maximum level to benefit from this lower gain coming from the preamplifier. So without Unitygain, then you have 8 dB of gain from the preamplifier, which in some cases might be needed. So we feel that it's necessary to give that option to the user. Yeah.
Is the function that we can use with other brands' power amplifier as well with Unitygain?
Yes, you can use our preamplifier. The preamplifier, definitely, you can use it. The Unitygain, good question. I haven't been asked that question before, but no, yes, you could. You can use the Unitygain function on our preamplifier with any amplifier. Yeah.
Now, you want to show us what's in the box in here?
Well, yeah. Well, I'm traveling quite often in Europe with a vinyl collection. I have 3 cases like this. So obviously in Europe, I have sometimes my car, so it's easier to carry. But on a trip like this, I can only take 1 box. So I brought my favorite records, shall we say, and maybe I can take you through it just really quickly. So to begin with, I always have a couple of extra CDs just in case there's any problem with the internet and also test. But first thing you should do is obviously have a test vinyl to make sure that all the different tones are performing the left channel, right channel, in phase, and so on. So exactly. So that's always a good thing to have. Like I was mentioning earlier, my uncle Christopher Durnley. So that's one of the records that he issued when he was the principal organist of St. Paul's Cathedral. So that I like to play. And then I like to play a lot of albums, a lot of music that people are familiar with. So almost everybody knows Elvis Presley's voice. And this is a nice album that he put out in the mid-'60s. And there's a track on here where there's some really beautiful background vocals, great instrumentation, and his voice is maybe at its best and beautifully recorded. So I like to play that. And then this is an album by Simply Red, where track 2, Same Old Red, has a beautiful bass line and some pretty splashy, but in a good way, cymbals. And I like to test the system out with that. It really brings out the high frequencies as well as the low frequencies. This is an incredible album, which a lot of people are familiar with. It's considered kind of an audiophile album because it's very, very well recorded, but at the same time, the music is absolutely gorgeous. Every track on this album is great, so I like to give demos with Monty Alexander. Plus, I've seen him in concert, so that's also nice to have. This is another album that I like to play because of the vocals. This is a crooner, we say, so kind of jazz singer from 1964. And actually, it's a German company called Alto that reissued it about 20 years ago, and they had Bernie Grunman do the mastering. So very, very well recorded. They only made 3,000 pressings, so quite important. That means every pressing of this album is very good quality, made in a very good factory. I'm a big fan of jazz music, of course, but especially Chet Baker. This is an album that he put out in the 70s that relaunched his career. It was actually thanks to Dizzy Gillespie, who bought him a denture because he had, unfortunately, big problems with his teeth. This is a gorgeous album with beautiful vocals, great fellow musicians such as Ron Carter on bass, or a very famous drummer called Steve Gadd. His voice is gorgeous, his trumpet playing, the orchestration, so really great album to play. Here I have, this is music that I was into when I was a young man, actually. It came out in the 80s. I bought this album when it came out, so 1982, I believe. And it's King Sunny a Day, and every one of the musicians, and there's like 20 of them, playing beautiful, unique instruments, and this is going all over the place. So the MBL speakers are having a great time reproducing an album such as King Sunny a Day. I have here my first of what's called Better Records. So this is a company out of California that I buy some of my vinyl from. What they do is they research who was the best mastering engineer and who was cutting then the lacquer cut for every album, that the person that was really doing the best mastering. And what they do then is they source these albums. Sometimes, like let's say this one, which came out in 1975, maybe the best pressings actually were from 78 till 81, if it was this mastering engineer that they've researched. And what they do is they buy as many of these records from that period and listen to them, and when they find real jewels, they will keep them and sell them through their website. So I have this album already on 180 gram pressing. It's supposed to be, you know, the best pressing and so on. But when I listen to this version of it, it's much, much better. More detail, quieter, more resolution. Possibly also because this was pure analog from the tapes to the vinyl, of course. Whereas the represses of today, the reissues are often been converted to digital, which is okay, there's nothing wrong with that, to be then re-equalized, to be remastered and so on. But quite often the original recordings, especially the mixes, that you should never change anyway, but the original masters by these individuals are fantastic sounding, or are the best sounding.
It's really expensive.
That's true. This one was about $200. Yeah, but if it's an album that you love, then it's worth it because you're going to listen to it a lot. This is an album by Ray Brown on a label called Concord, I believe. And this is a fantastic recording as well. I've seen Ray Brown in the Blue Note in New York, 1992, with Jeff Hamilton on drums and Benny Green on piano. And this is just a very, very good jazz album, very dynamic. Again, this is very well known also. Three of the greatest guitarists playing together on stage, beautifully recorded. Here's another album that I find very interesting. So this is called The Lost Recordings. A gentleman named Frédéric Doria Nicola somehow found out that there were a lot of recordings made of concerts, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that were broadcast for radio and then just put away in a vault to never to be touched again. And so he thought, well, maybe we could pay a royalty, pay a commission, and issue these on vinyl. So it took him a few years to build up the relationship with the different radio stations. But for example, this is one by Art Blakey. It's recorded in 1958, and that's the year his very famous album called Moanin' was released, and the song Moanin'. And this is the first time they're performing it, actually, and most of the people in the audience have probably just barely bought the album recently, so very interesting to hear. It's actually the only live recording, I believe, of that period. And there it was in a storage, in a vault, for over 60 years until the Lost Recordings got the idea to get the tapes and issue them on vinyl. They're very, very careful about the quality of the vinyl, the galvanization, and the whole process then of... so I highly recommend the Lost Recordings. Very well priced as well for the quality. So that was Art Blakey. I also have one here of Sarah Vaughan. Wow. This time it's from Holland in 1975. From a jazz festival, some of the most brilliant versions of Loverman and Fly Me to the Moon. So we'll listen to that together, okay? So yeah, that's just basically, and then have a Frank Sinatra, same explanation as I was giving about Elvis Presley. Almost everybody knows Frank Sinatra's voice. So you put this on and people can tell, wow, how close you're getting to the actual recording. With this record, this one is an exceptional pressing. You feel like you're in the studio with Frank Sinatra. Nice experience. Of course, you need some classical music, so I have some Mahler, and these are beautiful pieces, beautiful vocals, orchestration. Yeah, so I've got quite a few little, and then I've got Carmina Burana, also from Betra Records. Very difficult opera to reproduce, extremely dynamic. But again, it's nice to have a good pressing. And then you can, the good thing about these pressings, you can play them loud as well. So as I was telling you, I'm a big fan of the Beatles. So I brought three with me here, Sgt. Pepper's, Let It Be, and I just received this one a week ago, Abbey Road. And again, just sounding incredible. I've never heard Abbey Road like I've heard it now on this. And then when the show's got some people that want to listen to some heavy metal or hard rock, I should say, I've got here a very good pressing of Led Zeppelin. So one of the best mastering engineers for Led Zeppelin records is a fellow named Peckham. And he signs in the dead wax, in the matrix, his name is engraved as Pecco very often. And this is a Pecco pressing, so this is going to be a real joy to listen to at the show. I even have a bootleg from the Beatles here with me. The reason I brought this one is I have an a cappella version of the song Because, so it's just their vocals. And it's beautiful, a beautiful pressing actually, even though it's kind of a illegal pressing, because it's a bit of a bootleg. Found that in the UK. You find them at hi-fi shows, so another good reason to go to a hi-fi show. This is a test pressing, so that's why it's got a white label of Shirley Horn, an album she did in 1964 called Traveling Light. And this is a remaster, so this was reissued in 1997. And there again, it's Bernie Grunman who did the mastering, so very, very good quality. And then another favorite of mine is Harry Nilsson. He had a beautiful voice. The Beatles considered him to be the best interpreter of Beatles music. And he ended up becoming very good friends with John Lennon. Great recording. And then the last one for the evening, when everything's done, my favorite Chet Baker album, Sings Again, gorgeously recorded. And I just love his music. So yeah, that's what I've traveled with. So there's enough there to do my demos. Of course, Stevie Ray Vaughan, everybody knows this one, Tin Pan Alley. Again, great pressing that I have there. And Supertramp, of course, everybody knows Crime of the Century. But here we can, the harmonica at the beginning of school, and it's just floating in the air, it seems, and it's just a fantastic pressing. So yeah, that's about all I've got to bring and say maybe about my vinyl collection. But I'm very glad to be here for the show. I'm glad to be visiting your excellent store, beautiful store. I'm going to look forward to listening to a little bit of music here as well.
And give us some comments for Korean fans and Korean MBL fans as well.
Oh, okay. Well, if we are very, very supportive. Anybody who buys a product of ours, we, out of Germany, can easily give technical advice. If you send some photos, we'll give you advice about speaker positioning. What we ask is you just take 8 photos, one from each corner of the room and one from the middle of each wall. That'll really give us the perfect perspective of what the room looks like. And we do that quite often for customers in North America and in Europe, and we're very happy to do that to Korean fans of MBL, for example. And yeah, if you're mixing and matching with different electronics also, we take the time to give you advice about that, to match it perfectly with an MBL speaker or an MBL electronics with a different speaker as well. So yeah, we're here to help you. Oh, and the last thing would be try to go to concerts as often as possible. Very important to be kind of reminded of how good music is when you go and see it live, and it'll give you a better idea as to how your system is sounding. So I think it's, and it's important to help musicians. There's a jazz club here that I go to every time I come to Seoul. It's called Tokyo Live, I believe, and there's a Frenchman actually who's playing the piano there. I think he's one of the best jazz piano players I've ever heard, and he's training young Korean, of course, musicians. Every time I go, it's like there's a young drummer who's learning and a young bass player, and he helps them to get to a very high level. And the 2 young people I saw yesterday were playing. Easily they could play in Paris or New York, if you ask me. So the quality of jazz here in Seoul is very, very good.
Really?
Yeah.
Right. Thanks for your time, Mr. Hurburr.
It's my pleasure, really.
Hope this interview may help to understand the MBL more. So that's it for today. Have a nice day, and don't forget to press subscribe and like button. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.